So welcome everyone to this Jewish Muslim Research Network event. I am pleased to present today's session, which is Trauma and Memory, Thinking from Somali Diasporic Context with Amal Alhaag and Alessandra Benedicty-Kokken. And Adi will post a link to our upcoming events in the chat. And just quickly to say, I think we'll be taking questions in about half an hour. So if you'd like to type them into the chat or raise your hand, Alessandra and Amal will either read them out or unmute you. So I will hand it over to them. Enjoy, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Flora and Adi, just for the invitation, and Kelsey also, of course, and inviting us, most importantly, but also my colleague Alessandra for making the connection happen. And just to briefly introduce, my name is Amal Alhaag. I live and work in Amsterdam. I'm Somali, diasporic. I always say that because I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and then accidentally ended up in the Netherlands because my parents went in exile a bit before the war in '89. And this is also kind of what I will be talking about, speaking about trauma in relation to war and the colonial past, but also to be living in a country at the moment that is quite Islamophobic in its fabric. It's not only a Dutch problem, but it's also, of course, it's not only Islamophobic, it's also, there's quite an intense anti-Semitic, anti-Black. So there's some issues that are very present that somehow have informed also my work. And Alessandra and I work together at the Research Center for Material Culture in Amsterdam, which is the research center of the National Museum of World Culture. So all the ethnographic museums in the Netherlands have become one large institution, and we're kind of, I often say we're in the lab or in the more creative, experimental space, where at least for myself, then that you get to play and extend and expand the notion of research. And maybe Alessandra, you want to quickly introduce yourself before we start, or where did you go?
I'm here. Yeah, my name is Alessandra, and well, I have a way of introducing myself through Amal later. So you go for it, Amal, because I want to honor you and thank you.
Okay, well then I just wanted to kind of briefly bring you along in some of the research that I would say almost remix research that I've been embarking on for the past like 7-8 months. And I will share my screen, so bear with me for a little bit. I don't know if you can all see it. Yeah. So I will just start reading a bit from my notes, and it's an experimental note, so please bear with me. So this Everyday Sea Migrant project is really a project on roaming diasporic adventures and Tahrib goals. For this small introduction, I want to consider that trauma comes with resilience and joy and anecdotes. This is a continuation of an initial sonic and visual note that I shared in a previous session that was held in November 2020, also online, also because of the pandemic. And it was my first kind of small steps into a larger slow-paced research project called Everyday Sea Migrants. And with this project, I'm tracing and trying to think and bring together, but also dive deeper into the everyday histories of labor migration, cuisine, language, and cultural exchanges between East Africa and the Gulf, and the ways these histories unfold in the afterlives of the East African slave trade. The title Sea Migrants borrows with respect from the Somali poet Ashalul Muhammad Yusuf's book of poetry, The Sea Migrations, Tahrib, translated into Arabic and Somali. Dion Brand, the scholar and poet, said at a lecture 2 weeks ago that language unmoored from the regime that produces it reveals its brutality. I agree. This is also where trauma and joy come together for me. Last year, I had a conversation with the Zimbabwean writer Panashe Chigomamzi that in order to complicate and populate and narrate the lingua franca of Blackness and Black togetherness, we should attend with care to all the seas that hug the continent of Africa, not only the Atlantic Ocean. This is not to kind of negate the Atlantic Ocean, but is actually to kind of complicate what it means to think through the sea as a site for memory. Another moment that reiterates the urgency to embark on this thinking out loud process was meeting a fellow Somali in Florence. I was attending a lackluster edition of the infamous Black Portraiture Conference hosted in Florence, Italy. It was my first visit to the conference in the city of Florence. It was an odd confrontation with colonial history of Somalia and the fiction of where we miss the boat on Blackness in a global context when it does not attune to the direness of sea migrants, survivors of the Mediterranean Sea, right in front of our excellent eyes. I was trying to unpack the problem with American imperialism and what it means to be Black in a country that is, in a way, anti-Black, inherently anti-Black, when it still has not negotiated its own colonial past. So meeting these two young Somalis who recognized me as one of their fellow diasporic babies, we exchanged pleasantries in Somalis and went straight into the conversation that was about the journey, a journey full of trauma, a journey where the survival and the risk of not surviving is more likely the reality of many people at the bottom of the sea. A conversation that's just about coming out of the water as if Abdi was Mama Wata and didn't just survive the horrific journey from Somaliland via death or burial grounds for African, which is a site that has become a burial ground for African intellectuals, hustlers, lovers, and adventures in Libya. Abdi spoke with a technicality that can either be read as the inshallah survival mode or pure daredevilness, or both. I just came out of the water after a journey of 2 months. I'm here to meet my friend and I will continue my journey to Denmark. I nodded and couldn't say anything else, but thought of Watson Shearer's words, the young Somali poet. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as a well. So I wish you a safe journey, Walal. This was a call to act upon some of the random roaming thoughts I had ever since visiting my relatives in Abu Dhabi the year before. I had a long conversation with my grandfather about the Gulf of Berbera, now known as the Gulf of Aden. Poets who narrate Somali histories and our family's relationship to diasporiness willingly before 1977, the war between Ethiopia and Somalia, and unwillingly after the war and after the realities, after the scars of this war that was mostly held in the lapse of the Revolutionary Somali Front in Somaliland in the 1980s, it became that my life and the life of many of my relatives became synonymous with exile. To be in exile is a constant speculative negotiation with histories. In other words, everyday sea migrant is an ambitious failure to face the guilt, taboos, poetry, and recording of the adventures, relationships, and migrations narrated through personal, intimate, and everyday speculative stories. I hold on to speculation as a methodology, as a research practice, because it is what connects my reality with different forms of history making that has always excluded people that don't only look like me, but also people that look like many others, people that are othered, people that are racialized. So with this project, I'm really attempting to dive deeper, as I said before, into what it means to be in relation with each other. And specifically, also to think from this Somali cultural foundation that I have that is very much rooted in the Somali poetry, but to also face the East African slave trade. And in order to face that, it means that one has to also really think with and alongside the sea. In this context, the Indian Ocean is an important space for memory work. The Somali poet Ali Jimali Ahmed reminds us that in the Horn of Africa, catastrophes may abound, The calamity that besets this region can equally be explained through its antiphony, the perseverance and cosmic, albeit cautious, optimism of its people. A horn, after all, is also a way of making music. For the sake of time, I want to focus on two images. My grandfather, Ahmed Umar, was born in Aden, Yemen. My mother, Safia Ahmed Umar, was born in Aden. My father, Abdurrahman Haji Ali Shirwa, was born in Aden. I'm born in Cairo, Egypt, as I mentioned before. My father's father was a seaman who traveled the world and lived in Harlem in 1920s. My uncle Ahmed Haji Ali Shirwa was a seaman who lived since the 1950s in the UK. I'm telling you this because I use my family's migratory history as a tool of navigation. In this prelude, I'm roaming around the city of Berbera, the ports of the Gulf of Berbera, now known as the Gulf of Eden, and the airports of Mogadishu, to annotate the coming and going of my relatives, people, goods, stories, and trouble. The geographies of the imagination overseas is boundless. Lived memories are platforms upon which we may stand to glimpse the horizons in the shape of future destinations. The line between sky, land, and sea blur. It's all a matter of perspective. If we want, we could see limits for human maps are mere suggestions. Actual routes are only born out of dire experience of the sea. You are looking for a map, Haji Qura asked. The sea is the map. We also know that Derek Walcott said that the sea is history. But in the context of these types of stories, histories collapse into each other, quarrel like annoyed siblings, and perhaps in the context of this specific sea, the sea is a historian, preferably non-heroic, non-binary, to be precise in Somali context. The sea might be a poet, documenting the rupture of life, relationships lost in exchange. It is with this in mind that I want to zoom into the Gulf of Berbera. Up until Somaliland became a protectorate of Britain, Berbera was the most important Somali sea state that engaged in the trade network connecting Somali merchants with Egypt, India, China, Yemen, and other surrounding Gulf states. Somali sailors used to use the ancient Somali maritime vessel known as the Beden to transport their cargo. The interior land of the Somalis, but also Ethiopia, was dependent on Berbera for trade. Berbera was the most important port in the Somali peninsula, but between the 18th and the 19th century. For centuries, Berbera had extensive trade relation with several historic ports in Arabia. So that's kind of like everything from, I would say, Iran all the way to Turkey and the Indian subcontinent. Additionally, the Somali and Ethiopian interiors, such as the city of knowledge, Harar, in Ethiopia, were very dependent on Berbera for trade, where most of the goods for export arrived from. During the 1830s trading season, the port town swelled up to 70,000 people, and upwards of 6,000 camels laden with goods arrived from the interior with a single day. Berbera was the main marketplace in this entire Somali seaboard for various goods, but it was also site for slavery. And I think to reckon with this complex history is also to consider one being complicit in this history. And this is why I've been very interested in that kind of complex space of being complicit in this specific history, and to also represent a multiplicity of positions, to be a child of refugees or to be a refugee, but also to be able to face the reality of what it means that one's own people, this is kind of where the fiction or the speculative comes in, that mostly one's own people were part of this particular slave trade. And it was not necessarily trading that much other people, but it was also gender trade. So if it means that I put myself into the reality of the 18th, 19th century, meant that it was gendered, as in Somali women were taken as concubines to the Arab Peninsula. And it is kind of this heavy loaded histories that one carries within them, and that I think means also demands that one has to sometimes, I wouldn't say soothe them, but parallel to it, one also has to negotiate and narrate the histories of joy simultaneously, not necessarily to negate each other. And I will not annoy you with more of the seafaring and that type of complex story, because it becomes a different small presentation. But I really wanted to kind of end here, because I feel to kind of do this type of memory work where fiction and nonfiction meet each other, it also means that one has to find different tools of negotiating with these archives that are in different sets of languages. But it also means not to only look into the past, but also to be able to face the way the trauma has been multiplied through colonialism, and to be in these afterlives of these particular slavery pasts. And I mean also the multiplicity in slavery pasts, and to sit with the war as an ongoing trauma in the Somali context. So I wanted to end there and to at least offer space for Alessandra, and then look forward to the conversation.
Just a sec. Okay, I am actually quite moved. Well, I'm always riveted by the work that you do, Amal, and I'm extremely moved right now, because the reason I wanted to do this was partially because when I had proposed it, I hadn't really heard your work, because we're always working on other things for the museum. And I was very shy about telling you that I'd written these 2 articles about Igiaba Scego's work and Abdurrahman Wabari's work. And it's because I was called to them, not because I am in any way thinking about continuing the work or anything, but it happened, and it's too long to go into why it happened. But I was lost, and I could find very little scholarship to back up some of the literary readings I was doing. And I felt it important to put Scego's work in conversation with Anglophone Farah's work and Francophone Djiboutian Radi Wabari's work, because I felt we were reading these in Romance languages and departments separately, and they led me to each other. And so much of what you said is what I found in the very few articles I could find, and I really worked hard to find. And so when we were working on that project about extractive labor in the Indian Ocean and thinking slavery from Africa, and hearing you speak, I thought this, and so I'm very grateful to Flora, Adi, and Catherine for allowing us to come together. Because I remember you saying how deeply connected to waterways and inland routes that are complexly implicated in varying forms to colonial technique. And so that brought me back to this work I'd done a long time ago. So I just want to quickly go through a few novels that resonate with Amal's work. Adua, originally published in Italian by Giunti Editore in 2015 and translated from the Italian into English in 2017. And I happened upon this, as I said. My goal in today's reading group is to think together so as to make me aware of scholarship already taking place that you might be aware of, and to query whether or not such lines of inquiry are worthwhile to be taken up in our scholarship. Not myself at all. I'm not interested in going forward. I've done what I felt I needed to do. But how I came to Scego's work, it was through the Black Europe Summer Seminar in Amsterdam, led by Kwame Nimako, and Camilla Hawthorne, a geographer at UC Santa Cruz, works closely with him. She is Italian-American, and Gabriele Proglio's work, where Camilla Hawthorne is thinking about the Black Mediterranean and thinks about unbounded geography that forces us not to understand borderings as per Fortress Europe, or even Europe, which is de facto a Fortress Europe. And I had never looked at the map this way until Camilla had asked me to look at it and to see these various seas and land routes as connected in this way. I'd always seen them as separately. And it was also the time when the documentary by Gianfranco Rosi came out, Fuoco a Mare, Fire at Sea, which got a lot of attention. And I looked him up, and he was born in Asmra. It was at the same time that I was reading Adua in Eritrea, where he lived until he was 12 when he was evacuated because he was Italian colonial, and it was no longer safe for him as an Italian colonial to be there. And I thought it was interesting that he was turning his attention to Lampedusa and the way Lampedusans were I don't want to use the word saving, but were engaging with the sea migrants that were coming. So this was all, and then it made me realize Adua was writing this in 2014, which was one of the most deathly years for crossings of the Mediterranean, but the majority of those people crossing and how the death tolls are talked about were from the Horn of Africa. And so that Frank Rosi, who himself had a personal history in that space, was also thinking this and came out with a film at the same time. And so resonating with what you were saying, Amal, about this lack of attention towards sea migrants, and especially sea migrants coming from the Horn of Africa. And so there are these two novels, both rather short. The one is Adua, and the other one is Waberi's Aux États-Unis d'Afrique, which begins as an inversion where Africa is of stereotypes, where Africa is extremely wealthy, and a young woman, Malaika, who later changes her name or is spoken to as Maya, I'll explain why in a second, is thinking of going to Europe to help the poor Europeans in a sort of humanitarian aid work. So that's just the first couple of chapters. And then she realizes that humanitarian aid work is just a neo-colonial pursuit, and returns to Asmra to find grounding and to think through other ways of being in the world in relation with others. I'm going to go through this quickly and reflects on, I guess, but again, I had so much trouble. So if anyone can help me, that the etymology of the word Asmra refers to a legend in which 4 women from feuding communities came together. And so this idea that the Horn of Africa has always been a space where people live next to each other, but not in shock, or not in, well, maybe in conversation, but not necessarily in a Huntonian clash of civilizations, which is how the region is perceived now. And then this French quote here is very much the active calling upon of Glissantian thought, which scholar S.A. Smith also theorizes in Igiaba Scego's work. I was also really drawn to Scego's work and Waberi's work because of the complex women protagonists. And finally, what you also brought up is the invocation of Somali praise poetry and the veneration of the Somali language, which takes place in both novels, which in Waberi's novel, the protagonist Malaika Maya learns to speak through her vénérable mère, amatrice de musique classique et de philologie Somali. In the diegesis of the novel, Somali occupies a comparable role to Greek or Latin for learned Europeans, Swahili for South African intellectuals, and Fon or Yoruba for West Africans. So this is not my area of expertise at all. I just felt that these novels needed to be put into conversation. So and then finally, I was really intrigued, and that's why I brought it to this group, is trying to understand why Scego intentionally deploys Jewish Italian characters in her fiction, as per our readings, as per these readings that I offered. So one in the children's book, in which you see a young girl in the Venice ghetto, her name's Esther, and a little boy, Mohammed, and it's a long story, but they basically come together to help Mohammed return to his mother. And Mohammed is an enslaved boy under a Venetian noble. So my questions were, so what I'm interested in is how in recent history, the depiction of Somaliland or the Greater Horn of Africa has drastically transformed in international eyes. So until at least from the very few articles I could find, until at least the mid-20th century, scholars depicted the Horn of Africa as a cosmopolitan crossroads, which Farah's narrator in Maps describes as having once formed part of a Mediterranean world of values, a Mediterranean in which the northern and southern Mediterraneans were not yet pitted against each other, and a Mediterranean that one would not consider Mediterranean today, because one would not connect the land routes from these different waterways that both Amal and I depicted in our maps. Yeah, maybe I'll skip this so we can discuss more. But what I was really interested in this reading group, and I'm so grateful to it, is this idea of thinking that there has always been a cosmopolitanism between and among those understood as Jews and Muslims, and then looking towards how Igiaba Scego in an Italian public space is thinking this cosmopolitanism, but imbuing it with her own cosmopolitanism of a Somali mindscape, which again, I am not at all in any shape or form an expert. It was just this close reading of these 3 novels. And so that is what, so my questions, I mean, where I would want to see if there is valid research going, if these are valid questions for potential research, or maybe it's already happening and I would love to learn more, is how does Scego deploy and bring back to life the ghosts of the colonial past and the neo-colonial present? And what is Scego's gesture in bringing back to life characters who are both Jewish and Muslim in her novels, which take place in Italy? So this notion, I think, which I've become very present with living in Europe, this notion of ghostliness, which is not the same as living in the United States when thinking, especially Jewishness. Then how does Somali praise poetry as per the scholarship of Fiona Mula? There's no way I could have done this article without her, and I hope one day I get to meet her and read more of her work, as well as Scego and Waberry's novels. Reshape our thinking of cosmopolitanism. What does the second person play, if any? Because both novels employ the second person very much, and I wonder if there's something related to Somali praise poetry in that. And then also the question of Islam from a Somali space, which scholar Saeed S. Samatar argues that Somalis cultivated an interpretation of Islam that led to coexistence and the resolution of conflict among Christians and Muslims in the Horn of Africa until the arrival of colonial European presences. So those are just questions that I was left with at the end of those articles, and I wanted to bring to the group. And yeah, anyway, it's a huge honor to be presenting alongside you, Amal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I haven't even thought of like some of the connection I did not make myself, so it's quite interesting that you brought this forward. In a way, we're kind of self-moderating, right? So maybe we just open up. I'm very into conversations, and you know, it's really not even, it doesn't have to be a question. It can just also be like maybe thoughts or associative thinking.
I have a question. Thank you so much, Amal and Alessandra. That was very fascinating. And I would love to read some of the novels that you've been reading and exploring, Alessandra. I just wondered, this question for either Alessandra or Amal. Amal, I'm not sure if you've read the works that Alessandra has been mentioning, the novels, but you were noticing kind of connections between the novels with the idea of kind of Somali and cosmopolitan thinking. I wondered if you could kind of expand on this, your use of the idea of cosmopolitan and what it means within the kind of the novelistic context you were exploring.
Me? Is that for me? Yeah, I was kind of insecure about using the word cosmopolitanism because it's fraught with very much. But I was thinking, for example, I was thinking about my own engagement with this working group and how I'm not at all in any sense have have never thought of myself as a Jewish studies person, but upon moving to, well, two things called me. One was when I was teaching at CUNY, or when I still teach at CUNY. The City College of New York has the largest Jewish studies program in the United States in terms of student enrollment. And part of that has to do, at least with the engagement of the students over and over again. And the classes that I shared with them was, how is it that the trauma of the Jewish experience has become so legitimized in the US American space? And I had understood that as in the global northern space until I moved here to Europe. And so working through that, and they're very interested in Jewish studies for thinking through their own pasts and their own heritages, especially to the Caribbean, as many of the students at City College of New York have Caribbean heritage. So that was one area. And then the other area was thinking that I was always attracted to sort of North African literature through works that were always thinking Islam and Judaism together. So that's how I'm thinking of it, as cosmopolitanism in a very loose way, not in a strict way of considering various like Appiah's version of cosmopolitanism and all these questions there. Just thinking this sort of togetherness, and that seemed to come together in the novels. And for me, it's obvious that Scego is deploying that openly. And I've heard really horrible things about why did she put in Jewish characters. I think there's a really mean sort of space of criticism that accuses her of trying to please a white audience. And I don't think that's the case at all. The more I read it, the more closely I read it, she's doing something. And I think the more I live in Europe, I understand there's something about ghostliness that is present here. I feel like I'm in a ghost town in Amsterdam of the multiple complex layers of what Jewishness is in Amsterdam, from the Sephardics and it resonates with what you were saying, Amal, and their role in the trade of enslaved persons, to Ashkenazi, to the Holocaust, and all of these very implicated spaces that aren't all innocent, right, in the Rothbergian sense. So that to me is this feeling of hauntology, and why everyone's studying hauntology in Europe, and it makes sense to me now. And I think that what she's doing perhaps is bringing to the fore that if we're going to think the hauntology of sea migrants, maybe it would also be helpful to think the hauntology of the various traumatic experiences of the Jews in Italy. So I don't know. I think she knows exactly what she's doing, and it has nothing to do with trying to please white audiences. So yeah, that would be my answer. I mean, I have a question for you, Amal. Is how would you understand, because you're so familiar with the US American public sphere and also the European public sphere because of all your work curating at the Venice Biennale, traveling to New York often. How do you understand colonialism, how the United States public sphere interacts with colonialism versus how the European public sphere does?
I think that's quite a interesting question, because I somehow, of course, the colonial imperialist past are very much, attached to the European countries. Like if you think about what is considered a motherland, people often don't think of the US, but of course, in relation to the Philippines, and even if you think much closer, Hawaii, and I mean it's quite complex because inherently it's always a colonial settler state, but then the way its story is narrated, it's almost devoid of, or perhaps because it has these layered violent histories from the foundation of it being a colonial state, then on top of it slavery, then, you know, all these, and the genocide of the indigenous communities and the people. So I always found it complex to compare them, but, you know, there is no US without Europe, right? In that sense that at the, and when I think about technology of colonial state technologies as the police and, you know, the police apparatus, or the way kind of the techniques that were used during slavery across the Americas was also kind of very much always traded. Like I feel there's always this idea that in the US, there was a different type of slavery techniques used. I just, and never hear that there was this kind of sharing of strategies and exchange of strategies to one up on each other. Or if you think about some islands, like if I think about my partner and him being St. Lucian, and the way St. Lucia changed just over the centuries, the colonial country, like between, you know, the UK, then France, Spain, it just kept going on. And when you think about like, what does that do then with the type of violence that's perpetrated, the way it's kind of the innovation as a technology, but even more, someone wrote surveillance. And then when I think about it, I really think about the current state. And if I have to bring it close to being Somali, the current foreign policies of the US and the way it up until today is really violating the lives of many Somali people, many people in East Africa. And that has to do, of course, with this war on terrorism, and it's this anti-Black war on terrorism that is specifically violent. Because whenever the first time I started hearing about what are they called again? The things that fly, the surveillance, the violent little, what are they called?
Drones.
Sorry?
Drones?
Yes, drones. That my grandmother was talking about drones in around 2008-9, that they were flying over Somali nomadic land, and I think and the way it kind of influenced the possibility Somalis to travel, you know, like being banned, being on this list together with Sudan and, you know, many other countries, and how that shapes the reality regardless of what passports you carry. I might as well, every time I go to the US, when one thinks of surveillance and the type of apparatus that is in the afterlives, that is kind of controlling multiplicity of people's lives, but specifically the way it shapes the way some of us can travel, not only in the US, but also in Africa. I think of, even for me, every time the past few years, every time I try to go to the US, it's a huge question mark if I actually can enter the country, even if I'm there for comfort. It doesn't matter what your privileged social status is. At the end of the day, you're Somali with the possibility of being potential terrorists. And I think that type of violence, I feel that is also, again, in relation, I'm like speaking associatively, but I feel that is to me what it means to be in the afterlives of colonialism and slavery, and the way it has trade, the way Europeans and the Americas as imperialist nation states have traded strategies. And I feel that one of the ways these strategies are surveilling many lives in the moment is either through the police apparatus or through traveling restrictions and being blacklisted. And which also means that then the sea becomes another means of traveling, like whether that is coming from, you know, trying to enter the US via Haiti or entering Europe via the Mediterranean Sea. I feel there are different seas, but it's the same type of violence one has to face while people are actually not, like I said in the quote of Washan Shira, they're not leaving home just for the sake of leaving home. People are leaving home because home is at the moment like the mouth of a shark. So yeah, that's how I kind of think of it. But yeah, it's not often, I feel it's not often enough thought together, and the way these, you know, the concepts of nation states in both in the US, in the Americas in general, and in, I also include Canada, by the way. I find often Canada is left out as if all violence is kind of represented by the United States of America.
What you said about leaving the home only if it's like a mouth of a shark resonates so much with Waberi's critique of nomadism in European theory, especially Deleuze in thinking rhizome and nomadism as these idyllic ways of being. And both authors, I think, or for sure Waberi openly says, one does not leave home unless one needs to leave. Nomadism isn't something that we poetically choose, it's something we have to do. I
think that's a complex one though, because it's the same complexity as cosmopolitan. I understand why Scego is using cosmopolitan as a way to kind of, you know, create some sort of recognition, but inherently cosmopolitan within the African context is always some sort of connected to the civilized African, the intellectual African. It's not the, you know, the mediocre everyday African, where I feel sometimes largest part of being free could be that you could just be mediocre as much and as possible. And I feel that with, I'm familiar with Scego's work and I really love the work. I also feel me and her are from different part of Somali culture. The different parts of the regions, like for example, part of my family are sea people, another part of my family are nomadic, and I feel the notion of the nomadism, it is the same type of nostalgia that, you know, is attached to the gypsy culture, but it's also I mean, I don't want to touch on the violence that is also attached to gypsy, the notion of the gypsy. But for us, if I think about my maternal lineage, to be nomadic is a way of life. So it's not even, you know, but it does not mean it needs to be made romantic or romanticized, because it is also a way of surviving, but there is a whole cosmological, astrological knowledge and spiritual system attached to it, a philosophical system that is inherently has perhaps over-dominated what today has become the Somali. And I think maybe what she's reaching for, or what they're reaching for, is a more less homogeneous notion of the Somali. And that, of course, is also fueled to the colonial kind of the nation state when the Somalis became one. Although we represented like 5 different regions, the negotiation with Ethiopia was that one region went to Ethiopia, one became part of Kenya. And I don't know, many people probably might have seen ever the blue flag with the star. The star represents the 5 different regions. And I feel that type of this homogeneous, this love affair with the homogeneous nation state is almost an impossible thing on the continent, because most nation states consist of a multiplicity of different ethnic groups, and the Somalis might be one of the few that might have 93% or 94% of the people are ethnic Somali. But it does not mean that we're all the same just because we're all ethnically Somali. So I understand, and at the same time, I'm cautious of the way the nomad is kind of pushed aside sometimes, also in the way it's in the Somali theoretical context.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. I don't want to keep asking questions unless there's, are there questions that Anybody?
Yeah, comments?
Oh, I see Adi has his hand.
Yep, hello. I just saw Tyler's message. If you do have a question, you can use the raise hand function, and then Alessandra or Amal will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. But let me just go ahead and say that this was very interesting to hear both your takes and to learn a little bit about the work that you're doing. Alessandra, you asked 3 questions with your last slide, and I thought they were very, very interesting, productive questions. But I was left wanting a little bit. I wanted to hear how you would answer those questions yourself, because they were very, very, very thought-provoking questions. But I was just wondering, what exactly do you make of them? In particular, I think this question of why are these characters, these Jewish and Muslim characters, being brought into this story, and also I think something that I didn't really think about, this question that you asked here about the role of the second person. I was just wondering if you could maybe make a speculative gesture towards these points that you brought up.
Okay, so first the question of why is she deploying characters who she identifies as Jewish. So I wrote these articles before fully moving to the Netherlands, and I was only coming here in the summers. And I had this impression that there was a very vibrant Jewish life in the Netherlands. And now that I've been speaking to people, so I am 4 generations not practicing Jewish through my mother's line. And I come from a pretty, I'm proudly from a very prominent intellectual Jewish family in the United States. And so who has a very clear point of view on Israel. And I think it's a very divisive question everywhere, but especially in the United States. And so my family's quite outspoken about it. And so when I came here, I realized that and talking to other people, one has to either be practicing Jewish, so religious, or one doesn't speak about it. And so it feels very ghostly. And also, I think in terms of the talks we have about colonialism, it also feels very ghostly. And so I think in a way, perhaps so the way I'm reading her work now is she's bringing in various ghosts of the European project. And part of that project is one that has racialized various groups of people. And some have chosen to leave, mostly Europe, and especially the Netherlands and Italy, to go places where they feel comfortable, even if they don't completely agree with the politics of that place. So I'm thinking of the exodus of many Jews after the Holocaust to Israel and to the United States. So I think it's bringing this notion of ghostliness, and especially if she's writing these 2 books, one in the very presence of the sea migration trauma, immense tragedy. Both of them after, since that has become very clear that it's taking place. It's operating a ghostliness of something that has been legitimately at least apologized for in most nation states in Europe, whereas there's not even acknowledgement of the tragedy of the sea migration Holocaust that's taking place in the Mediterranean. So that's one, I think, I'm not sure, but I'm inviting this conversation because I don't feel capable of answering these questions. And the other question was the one about in the mode of the U. I've become very interested in reciprocity from my research on Vodou. And so to me, I think I'm very interested in how these 2 authors who place themselves in Somali diasporic thinking are writing novels that very actively use the mode of the U. So the entire in the United States of Africa is narrated in a voice of somebody, an older person, it seems, who's speaking to a younger Malaika. And as this person becomes familiar, or these people, it's not clear if it's one voice or many, is speaking to her and is in absolute admiration of her. There's more familiarity, and she goes from being Malaika to Maya. So we never actually hear her voice in the first person. So I think, and then also one of the 3 iterations of Adua is Adu is the father of Adua speaking to her, and how he goes from judging her very enormously to then coming to terms with his own role as translator in a very important diplomatic moment between Ethiopia and Somalia. So she's working through this, how is it that Somalia and Ethiopia became so pitted against each other? So I'm very interested in the mode of the you as reciprocity, and therefore thinking through relation and opacity, where opacity calls upon relation not to be hierarchical, but to be reciprocal.
I just had a question. I mean, I think we're running out of time, but I wanted to know, because you said something about that either people are very actively, or you said more practicing Jewish or non-practicing Jewish in the Netherlands, in the context of the Netherlands, right? Is that what you?
That's my impression. So yeah.
But I feel language plays a huge role in the Netherlands. Like, I mean, if I think about the Dutch language, I feel Jewishness is mobilized in a way that it is almost used to silence those who are racialized and othered in different ways, while at the same time Jewish people are othered and racialized in different ways. So I mean, and I notice this often in the media, like, for example, in columns and in articles, and always in a disposition. And that's why I think actually this group of people is quite interesting, because it is often the group of people in the context of the Dutch are mobilized against each other, specifically in the media. And it is sometimes quite extreme, to the point where it reproduces a particular violence, and at the same time there is a silence there. So I do see what you mean with the ghosting and the silence and the gaps, but often it is surrounded by guilt, and, you know, this ongoing guilt that is at the same time mobilized to to really shut others down. And I often think around 4th and 5th of May, for example, and who is allowed to speak in the memory of, you know, who's allowed actually to ask questions. And we had one incident where young women, hijabi Muslim Moroccan girls, were one of the speakers. And they kind of made a gesture towards refugees in their talk. And I think it was one sentence, and that sentence was everywhere. And it was like, we should never invite them anymore. They should should not take up the space. And this is something I've noticed in the Netherlands. Historically, it has been also present ever since, you know, the Second World War, since the Holocaust. But I was also thinking a lot about, when you spoke about haunting and the ghost, I really thought about it in the architecture. So when you spoke about Amsterdam, for me, especially where the museum is, that whole, if you know that neighborhood, I feel that's like a ghosting space. It's like an intense place to walk around because of that loaded history that is commemorated but not embodied.
Well, and I mean, what you're saying at the end, I think, comes from the fact that you're aware of what trauma looks like and feels like. So you walk around there feeling like it's ghosted, but other people won't. And I think also the pitting against, it's what Rothberg does so brilliantly, is says, I mean, Jews also have to deal with their own implicated history. And I think the work of Sarah Phillips Castile and Heidi Kaufman on looking at slavery, the Caribbean, and European Judaism implicated in slavery is really important, because then that allows people to say, we can't pit against each other because we're all implicated. What you were saying yourself about Berbera and a troubled history of what it means to have traded your own people. And I think that conversation has to happen amongst Jews, especially in or about Europe, because otherwise it remains this pitted conversation. And I mean, the only person I know who's doing that work that's been published is Rothberg and then Castile and Kaufman. But without that work, from whichever perspective we are, we can only go forward. And that's why I have just loved working in, RCMC alongside you, because then it allows a more complex conversation. And that perhaps is what cosmopolitanism is. I guess we have 2 more minutes, but I've been trying to unmute Tyler, but I don't know how it's worked. I can't figure it out. It's not working. Oh, there, great. Okay, super.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have to go to class at 12 p.m. So I don't want to start anything that I can't finish, or none of us can. But yeah, I'm at the University of Michigan, but I'm at the School of Information. But I've recently been really interested in just kind of researching, just like the diasporic narrative and mobilization narrative, particularly like, I guess in my own, just like in my own seeking and searching as an African-American who didn't really learn or was taught at like a younger age, about my historical context. But one of the things that I've been really, I think it's really quite interesting, I keep hearing in a lot of the talks and readings, is around this like world making and speculation that you brought up, Amal, in your talk. And I guess my question was going to be centered around in terms of, I guess like the next that like we're identifying right now, right? And this is the time where we're speaking truth, and we're uncovering the layers. But I'm interested in understanding and hearing more from you guys in terms of like, so what's the next step of the world, like the world making in that, right? We're speculating towards where, and where does, where does that fit in all of that? Your work fits in all of that. But yeah, it's 12. So I guess that's it. But thank you. This was so great. I'm very new to the topic, but I really enjoyed the conversation and just being present here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I understand you have to go, so it's the race against time. But I work in exhibition space, so I work in not only in the exhibition, but kind of bringing things in the public. So for me, it always has to it has to return to the doing, and it has to be a larger conversation among different people. So the speculation will only continue in that way. But I use research more as in a beginning phase to, touch base and to connect and to figure out in what ways do I want to tend to this knowledge, these sources of knowledges, and how do I sit with these histories, and then I invite others in, because I think it should never be a solo. In that sense, with all due respect, I'm not an academic, so for me, research is really a playground, and then it always has to lead to something public that is living. And in the context of the Somali project, it has to be in the spoken form, because that is the way the culture actually comes together. So that's how I should also invite others in.
So thank you so much, Amal and Alessandra. That was an amazing event, and we're very lucky to hear you both speak. And I'm happy that you two connected in a new way outside of the museum.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. I've posted our upcoming events in the chat again. I'll just send that link now, and enjoy the rest of your days or evening.
Yeah, thank you all for the invitation and the caretaking, and wish you a wonderful day as well.
Bye.